Hey fearsome friends. Not everyone wants to be able to feel safe and secure in their own neighbourhoods, but the stories I'm about to tell you certainly give you food for thought. So sit back, relax, get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. This happened 3 or 4 years ago, and I randomly reflect on it every now and again. At the time, I was home from college for the summer, and my parents were out of town with my sister for a dance competition, and I was tasked with taking care of the house and our dogs while they were all away. It was either a Friday or Saturday night, and I had some friends over to drink, hang out, and then go to the bar. We lost track of time, catching up and having fun, and decided to head to the bar at about 11:15 p.m. One of my friends lived about a 5-minute walk from my house and realized he had left his ID, well, his entire wallet in fact, at home. So he ran ahead to get his wallet, whilst my other friend and I cleaned up a little bit, got a roadie and headed over to meet him where we were all going to call our Uber. For context, my parents' house is in a residential area just outside of the city, so it's filled with families and old couples, etc. So as my friend and I head out, we noticed a man was walking his German Shepherd a little ways behind us in the same direction we were going. Though we both remarked that it was strange a man was walking his dog close to midnight on the weekend, we just carried on. We were both 21 at the time, and we're walking with a red Solo cup and just chatting. But as we got within about a minute of my other friend's house, my friend leaned in close to me and said, "I think this guy is getting closer to us." I nervously glanced over my shoulder and disagreed with him in an attempt to stop any panic. I then looked back at him, and as I did, my friend did the same and yelled, "Oh my God, yes he is." And I kid you not, as I heard this, I looked back and the man and the dog broke into a full-on sprint. My friend and I freaked out, threw our cups down and booked it. When we got to my friend's house, we ran up the driveway, got to his side door, only to find it was locked. We aggressively banged on the door, thinking this guy and his dog were going to attack us, but they just stood at the end of the driveway, looking at us. My friend screamed at the guy, asking what he wanted and why he was chasing us. Getting a good look at him now too, we could tell the guy was older and had a scruffy voice. "You're trespassing," he replied. We both yelled back in unison that this was our friend's place and we were waiting for him to come out. I was freaking out at this point and trying to catch my breath to yell at him. "Who are you? Neighbourhood watch or something?" "Yep," he replied. Now my family has lived in the same house for my entire life, and I have never once heard of there being a neighbourhood watch, let alone a neighbourhood watch that patrols the streets late at night. After his answer, he and the dog turned and walked away. There was a pretty large brick wall on either side of the driveway too, so once they'd walked away, we could no longer see them. Then right at that moment, my friend came out of his house with his wallet, asking what we were yelling about, and to shut up as his parents were sleeping. Our Uber arrived just at the same time, so I ran to it at the end of the driveway, then looked down the street and didn't see a thing. I asked the driver if he had just seen a man and a dog walking down the street. "No," he replied. "I just came from back there," pointing in the direction we had seen the man and dog go, "and I didn't see anyone or anything just now. Not once have I seen that man or dog since, and it still haunts me to this day." So from roughly 4th grade to the end of 5th, I lived in this kind of crappy apartment building. It wasn't like drug dealers at my door crappy, but it wasn't great. On one particular night, I was lying in bed, listening to staticky country music from my old radio while trying to sleep, when I heard a loud banging from somewhere. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from at first, but then I realized it was the apartment above us. It sounded like someone was banging on the floor. Much to my annoyance, I turned down my radio and listened again, when I heard the neighbour's little girl, who was about 6, crying, and she kept banging on the floor. Out of tiredness and annoyance, I stood up on my bed and banged on the ceiling, and she stopped. Then the next day, the same thing happened. I heard banging, turned down my radio, and banged up on the ceiling. This went on for 3 days, communicating with this little girl through banging on the floor and the ceiling. On the 4th day, she kept banging, crying and screaming. It was super late at night, so I don't think anyone else heard it. But it was like someone was ripping a cat's fur out one by one. I banged on the ceiling to see if she was okay, and everything went quiet for a second. I banged again. Then after a few seconds, she started crying again, and I heard this super loud bang, like someone had just dropped a cinder block on the floor from 10 feet up. Everything went quiet after that, and I didn't see her or her mum ever again. I didn't even see them move out, even though I knew they had. I don't know if there was something wrong with the family, like if the mum was abusive or anything. But it was weird, and I hope that that little girl is okay. So we, my boyfriend and I, moved to this place about 3 years ago. When one day, not long after, I was parking in the street directly in front of the building and our unit, and I heard a guy in his car say something along the lines of, "Bitch, get out of my parking spot." I later came to realize that this was my neighbor, who lives with his parents next door. I brushed it off. Then one night I was sitting watching TV in my living room, when I saw out of the corner of my eye a light, which turned out to be a flame from a lighter. That same neighbor was using it to light his pipe or joint, or whatever it was, and I know it must have been that, because he was constantly smoking pot on his patio. Anyway, his car was parked in front of my living room windows, and he was leaning on it, staring directly into my home. I closed the curtains, texted my boyfriend, and began to feel a little uncomfortable. Not long after that, it had turned nighttime, and I was doing the laundry in the building, when I noticed that a pair of my underwear was missing. Perplexed, I chose not to dwell on it. That is until the next laundry load, when I had 2 more missing. Now, I know I didn't drop them, as I am always very careful with them. So who the heck wants to put on underwear that's been on the dirty ground? At that point, I put 2 and 2 together that it was him. I had also heard a quick tap on my bathroom window, as I was showering at night one time. My boyfriend works nights, so I know the neighbor knew I was home alone, and was the one in the shower. Needless to say, this guy really did a number on my psychological state. I now hate going outside, and he ruined my sense of safety in my own home. I ended up taping a note onto the wall in the laundry room about it being punishable by law to steal underwear and to stop doing it because we see you. After that, he backed off. Another time when I was in my car and he was parked in front of me, he looked at me as I gave him the "do not mess with me, I'm backcrap crazy" look, and he hasn't messed with me since. If he ever did anything else, I would lose it. I know it's not a good idea, but I've been angry and depressed and bitter and anxious for far too long to deal with any more of his crap. Anyway, I wanted to share this, because I'd like to know who else has had creepy neighbours they've dealt with. I've been meaning to make a police report, but he stopped harassing me, so I just never got around to it. I feel that maybe the fact he lives with his parents might have helped too. Who knows what else someone who steals chonies is capable of doing? Very unsettling. I wanted to tell you guys about my mentally unstable neighbour, who I will be calling Kay to respect her privacy. Because I don't want to call her crazy or anything else that contributes to the stigmatism of severe mental illness, this story isn't going to be exaggerated to be more creepy than what it was. It's just what happened. Now, we had just moved into our new home, which we had recently built in a town in Texas. It started when my parents began finding small pills strewn about our backyard near the fences, just a few here and there. We googled the numbers on the pills to find most of them were antidepressants, but I can't remember the exact names, as this was about a year ago or so. But I think there was at least one pill that Google said was an antipsychotic medication. We were pretty confused, but mostly worried about our dog eating them before we could find them all. This kept happening over a few weeks, and then we found unopened water and Gatorade bottles thrown over our fence. The side of the house this was coming from had a somewhat empty lot next door. We had soon-to-be neighbours building their new house there, but it wasn't like the construction workers were throwing their trash over our fence. These bottles were unopened and full. For reference, Kay lives a few houses down from mine on the corner. Between our house and hers are two empty lots, the lot closest to us with a new house being built. After another week or so of this came the fights, or maybe incidents I should call them. Kay would routinely storm out of her house and go yell at the construction workers. I don't know what about, but apparently about nonsense things. Sometimes she would yell from her yard. Sometimes she would walk onto the lot to yell. Several times she was seen yelling at no one, just standing in the lot or walking around the construction supplies and arguing to herself. By now, most of the people on our street knew her and were afraid of her. Up to this point, I have never seen Kay. I attended university an hour away and was only home on the weekends. One weekend, my parents left me home alone in the middle of the day. I think they were at the gym or the grocery store. I'm an only child too, and I had just gotten out of the shower and walked downstairs to hear yelling. I took a look out the windows to see a middle-aged blonde lady arguing. I couldn't see who she was talking to, but I couldn't hear another male voice. Now, I had not met Kay yet, but I also hadn't met my new neighbours. So my first thought was that this was the new couple building next door, my new neighbours. It seemed like they were arguing about the house. After a few minutes, the blonde lady walked away, and then a couple came out of the unfinished house. They got into their car and parked on the street. I was really confused at this point, especially when the man walked over to my door and rang the doorbell. I'm very introverted, so I opted not to answer the door. Stupid, I know. My parents weren't home anyway, so it wouldn't have made a difference, I thought. After a minute, he walked back to his car, and from the window I could see he was sitting there on the driver's side doing something. He came back with a note that he left on my door, and then he and his wife drove away. After I was sure they were gone, I got the note and read it. Apparently my neighbours were checking out the house when they saw Kay, the blonde lady, attempting to get into my backyard. They confronted her, and that's what the yelling was. In a rush, I sent a picture of the note to my mum and called her, etc., but she didn't seem that worried about it. I knew that we always left the back door unlocked during the day, though. If she had gotten through our fence gates, she could have easily walked inside the house while I was home alone. After that, my stepdad got some new locks for the little gate doors at the front of our house. Things continued like this for a while, with Kay trying to get into our backyard, throwing pills and water bottles over our fence. A couple of times she was rummaging around our front flower beds too. And there was one instance which really unnerved my parents. We have a small alleyway that runs behind our house, connecting everyone's driveways. And another neighbour, who lives across the alleyway from us, contacted my parents to let them know they had seen Kay looming around our back fence at 3 a.m. that night. Not sure why those neighbours were awake at that time, but they said Kay was just standing there in the middle of the alleyway, staring at our back fence. Knowing we had someone essentially casing our house in the middle of the night, it was really starting to freak us out. The guy who built our house, who I'm naming Jay, somehow got in contact with someone who knew Kay's family pretty well. Everyone was wanting answers as to why Kay was acting like this, and since Jay had built most of the houses in the area and was well connected, people were asking him. I think he was friends with the realtor who sold the house to Kay, but I'm not sure. But Jay was able to give us a lot of information about her. Apparently her family was rich and owned a very big corporation, like one of the biggest in the US, and her family had essentially placed her in this house, away from the rest of them, as they didn't want to deal with her mental illnesses. But more importantly, 2 years ago, her only son died of a drug overdose, and she's been unstable ever since. I'm not sure if she thinks we're holding him hostage, or his ghost is here or what. But that's why. She's been to several psychiatric hospitals throughout her life, and now she's stopped taking her medication because she's throwing it over our fence. Things finally came to a head in January of 2020, when during one of her usual arguments with the construction workers, she pulled out a BB gun. She was already very aggressive, so the BB gun just made things 100 times worse. I don't know if she just threatened to shoot them or if she actually did, but the cops were called regardless. It took them a while to talk her down, with several police officers swarming the street with big guns. I'm thankful that my parents had been filing police reports, so when they came they knew about Kay's history of mental illness. I'm both grateful and a little surprised that they handled the situation so well, because not a lot of police departments properly train their officers to deal with mentally ill patients, especially ones experiencing psychosis. Anyway, after that incident, Kay was not seen for a long time. We heard she was in a psychiatric hospital for many months, after which she returned to our neighbourhood. She's doing much better now. She no longer does any of the strange behaviours she used to, and almost every day, me and my parents see her walk her dog past our house. She's clearly sticking to her routine, and I'm happy for her. I was 5 when he moved next door to us. As a normal kid, I was happy that my new neighbour had a kid that my twin sister and I could play with. But when my neighbour officially arrived, he was just a single man. No kids, no wife. My sister and I were sad about it, as we were really excited at the thought of making new friends. But then a few days later, I saw my neighbour acting strange. He had swung an axe at something, and being that young, I was scared and confused. So I went inside and told my mum what I'd seen, but she didn't believe me. Fast forward to when I was age 7, and my neighbour was screaming like a maniac, throwing stuff through his window. And the last incident was when I was 15, and he'd come over to our house with a gun in his pocket. I had been watching him from the window. I was scared he was coming to kill my family, so I called the police, telling the dispatcher that my neighbour was armed and was coming to our house. They said they'd be there in 10 minutes, when my dad suddenly yelled, "Run, go in a room." He must have seen the gun, I thought, and my twin and I ran into our room and closed the door shut. We put the dresser up against the door as a barricade and sat down in the corner of the room, trying not to make a sound. Mum and my brother locked themselves in the bathroom, whilst my dad was trying to reason with our neighbour. We heard a gunshot, and my twin and I began to cry, thinking that our dad had been shot. Just then we heard the police sirens from the street, multiple screams and more gunshots. Finally we were safe. My dad had been shot in the stomach, but thankfully survived. It turned out that our neighbour had a mental illness, so now he's at a hospital being looked after. From that day on, I'm always cautious as to who else out there might be capable of the same thing. So my sister and I take full precautions when walking through the neighbourhood, always fearful that the crazy neighbour might return. Oh boy, does it give me shivers to this day. For a little background, my grandma lives in a house that she inherited from her aunt, my great-aunt, after she died, and it's a beautiful secluded area along the Irish coast that is half an hour away from a city and within a lush green ivy forest by the sea. Proper Celtic fairy tale stuff, right? Oh, except she lives around some absolute nutjobs as well. One of them was a dysfunctional family that lives in a stone cottage across from our house. I only loosely know about what happened and why they were living there, but basically the dad was abusive. And before I was born, the eldest son got sent to prison for repeatedly raping the daughter. She took him to court with DNA evidence, but that's a different scandal. The youngest son, who I'll call CN for creepy neighbour, never went to school and is supposedly mentally impaired. Before I continue with this story, I want to clarify that CN was also probably abused growing up, and although it is very unlikely, I hope he gets the help and care that he needs one day, because from what I have heard, he is a danger to himself and others. Now, on with the story. It began on a summer's day, when my twin sister and I were about 6 years old, and we were staying at our grandma's house for the summer and playing on her lawn near the gateposts into her driveway, while she and our parents were inside preparing lunch. CN, who was still a young man, and would always hang around and enter neighbours' gardens without permission to say hello, was the mental age of a 7-year-old, and he just didn't understand boundaries, and was creeping people out. He saw us both playing, and came into the garden to talk to us. I can't remember if we learned about stranger danger at that point, but we assumed that he was one of my grandma's friends, and both talked to him just to be polite. My concentration as a child was terrible, and CN slurred his words as he rambled on. Like I mentioned, he was illiterate, and asked us questions such as if we liked the new t-shirt he was wearing. But then he started talking about his willy. I zoned out of the conversation up until this point. Hearing that word suddenly made my gut alert, because not long before my mum explained to me about how boys and girls have different sex organs in a way that I could understand, and how it was important that they were kept private. My sister and I stood silently as CN continued talking to us about his equipment. I am not sure how my sister was feeling or if she knew how to react, but I felt myself growing more and more uncomfortable the longer he stayed and talked, and was beginning to wonder if I should go into the house to get my grandma. Then CN asked, "Do you want to see my willy?" My cheeks and stomach were burning with shame at this point, while my sister squeaked, "Yeah," probably not knowing how to react either. My head was screaming, "What on earth are you doing? Why did you say yes?" Then I heard CN unzip, and I clenched my eyes shut and looked away while my ears listened for when he'd zipped himself back up again. I don't remember much after that, except a few minutes later, my grandma came out to the lawn, Mum and Dad in tow, and she calmly told my sister and I to go inside. Apparently, Grandma then proceeded to ask CN what he was talking about to us, and he told her that he was talking about lorries. But eventually she got the truth out of him. Later that day she called the police, and when an officer arrived he took a statement from my twin sister and scribbled down her account of what had happened. That night my dad went to the stone cottage accompanied by police and a family friend, who I will call Good Neighbour, GN. CN was scared of GN, because GN once punched him for coming up to his farm at night and frightening his daughters. So with backup, my dad knocked on the door, asked for CN and threatened to kill him if he ever came into my grandma's garden again. For the record, my dad is a pacifist that doesn't tolerate violence or confrontation, but this incident understandably made him very angry and upset. When I was at my grandma's house after that, the adults always kept a close eye on us from then on. They wouldn't let us go out alone, and understandably would get very mad if we disappeared. When we were old enough to be allowed to go out for walks alone, we were told to run back to Grandma's house if we ever saw CN and tell him. We're telling our dad if he tried talking to us. Thankfully, my parents would always usher us away if they did see him, or tell him to keep away. My grandma still gives him a Christmas card every year, but this incident really upset her, and she stopped allowing him into her garden after it happened. It must have been difficult for my parents to keep us both calm and help us understand that it wasn't our fault, but CN for being a very rude man. Nonetheless, avoiding CN in the neighbourhood always added a sense of adventure to the summer holidays. But as I grew up to understand what was going on and what happened to that family, it was a bit of a shock, and I still get unsettled thinking about it now. I'm so thankful that my gut told me to look away that day, because if I did see anything, then I probably would have been much more scarred for life than I am now. When I was 12 years old, my mama and I became homeless, and there was a waiting list of about 6 weeks before there was space for us at the local homeless families shelter. Thankfully, though, we were able to stay with a really good family friend of ours for the 6 weeks, which was a bedsit, communal living with shared bathroom, kitchen and laundry facilities. I was really happy with this arrangement, as Jay, the family friend, was fun, young and pretty, and she spoiled me rotten, getting me things to do and giving me lots of time and attention in between going to work. She also had lots of different people going in and out of her rooms at all times of the day and night, as it was what some people might call a party house. Most of the people living at the bedsit were awesome. There were a lot of musicians, actors and bohemians from all different backgrounds and cultures. I made cupcakes with a drag artist who worked in a Soho club, painted with an artist using her materials to make my mama a picture, and sometimes a goth band who lived there would come and jam, letting me play their instruments with them. They were all lovely people, and a lot of them became quite protective of mama and I. However, there was one guy, R, who mama was a little mistrustful of. R was around 25 to 27, tall, lanky, and really pale with brown sad eyes. At the time I was totally oblivious to anything major, but I always felt slightly different around him to the other people who came in and out constantly. The feeling didn't so much come from me, but rather R himself, but I couldn't put my finger on why, being only 12. I was always an outgoing, friendly kid around everyone I met, but for some reason I was more reserved around R. But one night it all kicked off. It was a Friday, and my Uncle P had come to stay. He was 28, lean and wiry, but he looked like he could handle himself. As I said before, Jay, the family friend, was more like family to us. She is my youngest auntie's best friend from the age of 3, and had in fact lived with my granddad, and their 9 children when she was a kid. So my uncle, Jay, and indeed my mama had all grown up together as siblings. That evening, Uncle P had made macaroni cheese for Mama, me, and himself, and Jay was getting ready to go out for the evening. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, and on saying "Come in," the doors open. R appeared. I was scratching my uncle's back. Our entire family absolutely loved this activity, and after Jay told R she was going out, and offering him a can of beer, she went to go get him one, when R said to me, "I'd like a back scratch too, sweetheart." When R said this, I felt my uncle bristle, and he scowled at R, and there was an awkward silence. Then my uncle got up to get himself a can of cider, and R followed my uncle into the small kitchenette. There were muffled voices, and suddenly we heard my uncle say narkily, "You're out of order, mate. She's my niece, and she's only 12 years old." Jay hurried into the kitchenette to try and calm things down, but the next thing I knew, R had run out of the bedsit really quickly, and my Uncle P came back into the living room with Jay close behind him looking vexed. Nobody said anything else about the incident that night, and Jay went out as planned. Mama, my uncle and I had a quiet family night in of playing board games and watching TV, and I heard Mama and my uncle talk quietly about the incident after I had gone to bed later on. The bed was in the living room, divided by a really thick, heavy curtain, but their voices were so hushed that I could barely hear them. In the following weeks, the other residents of the bedsit tried to have conversations about the incident with my Mama and Jay, but the only people Mama confided in was the drag artist and a biker who was really nice and kind, and I was never privy to those conversations. My uncle stayed another few weeks, and the 4 of us, along with the rest of the residents of the bedsit, had a good summer. I heard that R got nicked for drug possession, and I personally never saw him again after that night. The other residents talked about him probably having to move out because he fiddled their landlord out of rent, and after 6 weeks, Mama and I moved into the homeless family's shelter. So I'd just moved into a terraced house in Ghent, Belgium, and I worked in a bakery at that time, so I would regularly leave my house around 5:15 a.m. to start my shift. Now my bike that I park right by my front door is what I use to get about. One particular morning, as I was preparing to leave, I'd left my door slightly ajar, just in case I'd forgotten something and I needed to just pop in quickly before leaving, when I saw a man walking in my direction. I thought it was really strange. I mean, there's a guy walking around the neighborhood at this hour, with a cup of coffee in his hand. He walked up to me and stopped, completely invading my space. Then he greeted me and started asking me questions, whilst giving me this horny, longing look. He kept edging closer to me, then asked if I lived alone, was married and had children, how many of us were living in the house, and if I'd just moved in, etc. I kept avoiding his questions as best I could, as I could sense he had bad intentions, and my mind was screaming danger. I quickly shut my front door so he couldn't shove me in there, and I looked him straight in the eyes and calmly said, "I know what you're thinking of doing. I'm also good at remembering faces, so I can identify you easily in the future. If you don't walk away right now, I will call the police." He looked embarrassed and walked away with his head hung low, and I watched him until he disappeared around the corner. Now I know if I'd have acted scared and vulnerable, that man could have easily pushed me inside my house and raped me. I've heard of this kind of incident happening before, so I'm glad I was quick enough to assess the situation and slammed my front door shut immediately. I didn't run inside my house, because I wanted to show him I was in control and not him. If I had, I'm sure he would have come back to try his luck again. I went to work shaking, but also relieved, and had to keep checking behind my back every time I left the house that early in the morning. I've thankfully not seen him again since. So as of now, I have had many issues with this neighbour of mine, and so has my mum and many other people in the neighbourhood. He has threatened all sorts of disturbing things, for instance tying us up in straitjackets. It all started around Christmas of 2019, when he'd left some old nasty teddy bear as a gift for my little sister. It came in a grocery bag, and it smelled horrible. At first we thought he was being friendly, until we noticed the condition of it. Needless to say that we trashed it. So as one thing led to another, we ended up getting a camera put up at our front door, which is still there now. Some other notable things that he's said pertain to threatening the women in my neighbourhood, cutting down people's hedges in order to snoop on them, and cut down a huge tree that isn't even on his property. And what was funny about that is that it backfired on him, when a huge branch from that very same tree came down and landed on the windshield of his car, completely breaking it. I believe he was charged for the tree incident, and he must have had the police called out on him over 50 times at least. But despite all this, he hasn't actually done anything that would land him in prison. Now I'm from Canada, so our laws may be different. My mum recently told me that he has been talking to people about killing animals, which really worries me, because I've just gotten a dog. The police have told my parents about how he grew up with a very dominating and strict mother, which is why he's probably got it in for women. But I just want to find some way to land him in prison, or make him stop harassing people at least. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.